Upper East Side limestone, legacy in stone. In 1901, a New York stockbroker named Elias Asiel commissioned an architect to build him a house on East 63rd Street. He didn't want a house. He wanted an argument. Made in stone, carved above every window, visible to anyone who walked past. The argument was about money, but the word money never appears anywhere on the facade. Walk past the right block on 5th Avenue today, somewhere between 61st and 81st Streets, on a quiet morning before the taxis start stacking up, and something stops you. A row of pale stone facades, smooth and carved, sitting shoulder to shoulder like they were pulled out of Paris and set down here intact. Garlands pressed into limestone above the windows, iron gates at the base of low stoops, mansard roofs with copper that's gone the color of old sea glass, and an absolute settled confidence in the way these buildings face the world as if they have nothing to prove to anyone. That confidence is the story. Because it was entirely manufactured. These are New York's limestone townhouses, built in a narrow window between roughly 1890 and 1915 along the blocks flanking Central Park on the Upper East Side. They represent the Gilded Age at its most calculated, its most self-conscious about what money was supposed to look like and what it was supposed to say. They are not the tallest buildings in New York, not the most technically ambitious, not even the most expensive per square foot. But they are, in their way, the most deliberate. Every surface was a decision. Every carved cartouche above a window, every fluted pilaster, every inch of pale Indiana limestone, chosen not because it was the easiest option, but because it sent exactly the right message to exactly the right people. To understand why that message mattered so much, you have to understand what came before it. For most of the 19th century, the wealthy residents of Manhattan built in brownstone, a dark reddish-brown sandstone, quarried mostly in New Jersey and Connecticut, cheap enough to cut and ship in bulk. Brownstone was the default material of aspiration. If you were doing well, a merchant, a lawyer, a man of moderate means with social ambitions, you built in brownstone. You had your stoop, your parlor floor, your decorative cornice. You fit into the city's visual grammar. The problem was that everyone fit into it. And by the 1870s and 1880s, as the great industrial fortunes of America began to concentrate, the railroads, the steel mills, the banking houses, the men at the top of those fortunes had a specific problem. Their houses looked like everyone else's houses, a little grander perhaps, a little wider, but fundamentally the same material, the same color, the same vocabulary as the merchant 2 blocks over. That wouldn't do, and then the brownstones got old. Buildings from the 1850s and 1860s by the 1890s were starting to look worn. The stone darkened with coal soot. The ornament looked heavy and Victorian, out of step with a city that had decided it was now a world metropolis. Preservation advocates would later note that Upper East Side homeowners began to see their brownstone fronts as dark, decayed, and unfashionable, not the word of reformers or critics, but of the owners themselves. The houses hadn't changed. Taste had, and taste in Gilded Age New York moved fast and moved hard. Into this moment stepped limestone. Pale, smooth, precise, not the rough-cut stone of a country house, but limestone carved with the discipline of a Paris boulevard, symmetrical facades, mansard roofs, tall windows with iron balconies catching the light. The Beaux-Arts style, which arrived in America through architects trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, gave limestone its grammar. And firms like McKim, Mead and White, and the remarkable C.P.H. Gilbert began applying that grammar to private houses along Fifth Avenue with an intensity that would reshape the neighborhood entirely. The timing was not accidental. Central Park had been completed in 1877. Facing it was, by the 1880s, the single most prestigious address in Manhattan. The wealthy families who'd built in brownstone further downtown began moving uptown, and when they arrived, they did not want to replicate what they'd left. They wanted something new, something that announced not just wealth but a particular kind of wealth, cultivated international permanent, Indiana limestone, the same material used for Grand Central Terminal and the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Fifth Avenue itself, quarried in the same state, cut by the same trades, associated in the public mind with the most prestigious civic and cultural institutions in the country. When a private family clad their townhouse in that stone and decorated its facade with carved garlands and classical pilasters, they were borrowing the visual language of museums and government buildings. They were saying, "We are not merely rich, we are institutions." By the mid-1890s, the shift was complete enough to be recognized as a movement. Side streets just off Fifth Avenue began to fill with limestone-fronted townhouses, 5 and 6 and 7 stories tall, every inch of the street facade carved and refined. The brownstone blocks that had defined Upper Manhattan a generation earlier were being systematically replaced, face by face. Some owners tore down and rebuilt entirely. Others simply refronted, stripped the brownstone from an older structure and replaced it with limestone and Beaux-Arts ornament, grafting a new century's pretensions onto a previous decade's bones. The facade was always the point, not the house behind it, the face it showed the street. That is the central fact about limestone townhouses that everything else flows from. They were built to be seen from the outside, from the sidewalk, from a carriage moving north along Fifth Avenue on a Sunday afternoon. The interior could be as grand as the owner wished, but the interior was private, the facade was public, and the facade was where the argument was made. The argument being, this family belongs here. This money is legitimate. This stone will outlast us all. Over the next several decades, that argument would be tested in ways its authors never anticipated. The economics behind the stone, the labor inside the walls, the slow retreat of the single-family mansion before the advance of the apartment house, all of it would complicate the confidence those facades projected. But in the first years of the 20th century, walking up Fifth Avenue past block after block of pale carved limestone catching the morning light, the argument felt, for a moment, unassailable. Not every limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side began as someone's lifelong dream. Some of them began as a bet. A calculated, expensive, slightly audacious bet that if you built the right house on the right block, someone rich enough to buy it would eventually appear. That distinction matters because it tells you something about who actually shaped this neighborhood and how. The limestone townhouses of Fifth Avenue were the product of at least 3 very different kinds of ambition: the self-made magnate who wanted a permanent address, the speculative developer who wanted a profitable one, and the architect who wanted both to outlast him. Start with the architects, because without them, there is no story. By the 1890s, American architecture had a new generation of practitioners who had done something their predecessors largely hadn't. They had studied in Paris. What they brought back was not just a style but a conviction that the right stone, handled with precision, could make a private house feel like a public monument. C.P.H. Gilbert was one of them. A New York architect who built extensively on the Upper East Side from the 1880s through the early 1900s, Gilbert became one of the defining voices of the limestone townhouse. His 4 East 79th Street, commissioned in 1898, is a 5-story Beaux-Arts mansion in smooth limestone with a copper mansard roof, an entrance sequence designed to make anyone approaching the front door understand, before they had even crossed the threshold, that they were entering a serious house. John H. Duncan, who designed Asiel's house on East 63rd Street, brought the same vocabulary to a slightly narrower lot, a roofline that quoted the grand hotels of Paris rather than anything in the American building tradition. These were men who knew exactly what they were quoting and why. The clients who hired them were a more complicated group. The popular image of a Gilded Age mansion owner is a man whose family has been wealthy for generations, old money, settled, certain of its place. But the reality on the Upper East Side was considerably messier. James E. Nichols, who commissioned 4 East 79th Street, had made his fortune in wholesale groceries. Elias Asiel, who built 15 East 63rd Street, was a stockbroker. These were not ancient dynasties. These were men who had gotten very rich very recently in industries that carried no particular social prestige, and who were now in the process of converting financial capital into cultural capital. The house was doing work that the money alone couldn't do. On the other side of the transaction were the speculative developers who had no interest in the symbolism except as a sales mechanism. William W. Hall and his son Thomas M. Hall were among the most active builders of limestone townhouses in this period, and their approach was entirely unsentimental. They built 1014 and 1015 Fifth Avenue in 1906 and 1907, a matched pair of neoclassical limestone townhouses, each 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep, with fireproof construction, passenger elevators, extensive servants' quarters, and facades that deliberately echoed the Metropolitan Museum across the street. They built these houses without a specific buyer in mind. They simply built the most convincing possible product for the most affluent possible market, and waited. The wait was not entirely comfortable. The Hall brothers listed 1014 Fifth Avenue in 1907 for $335,000, a figure equivalent to roughly $10 million today. It sold in 1909 after the market wobbled in the panic of 1907 at an 18% discount. Even on Fifth Avenue, even in the Gilded Age, real estate carried risk. The house was subsequently leased at rents that in today's terms would approach $45,000 a month. The math worked, but it required patience, capital reserves, and a conviction that the Upper East Side's trajectory was upward and would remain so. The most deliberate act of neighborhood making in this period belonged to a man who never lived there himself. Henry H. Cook was a railroad magnate who assembled the entire block between East 78th and 79th Streets from Fifth Avenue to Madison, then sold parcels selectively and only to buyers who would build large private residences. He was not selling real estate, he was curating a neighborhood. The Cook block remained almost entirely single-family long after the rest of the Upper East Side had begun its conversion to apartment buildings, and was eventually landmarked in recognition of exactly that coherence. What Cook understood, and what the Hall brothers understood, and what the architects and their clients all understood, was that the value of a limestone townhouse was never purely a function of the house itself. It was a function of its neighbors. A single limestone mansion on a block of brownstones was an eccentric. A full block of limestone mansions was a statement. The game was collective, an arms race of refinement in which each new house raised the implied standard for the next one, and in which the cumulative effect was something no individual building could achieve alone. The facade they were building wasn't just for each house, it was for the whole street. And behind that collective facade, behind the carved garlands and the copper roof lines and the iron gates catching the afternoon light, sat a set of arrangements that the street view was specifically designed to conceal. The men who built these houses understood that the performance of effortless aristocratic living required a very large backstage. What that backstage looked like and who inhabited it is a different story entirely. Every so often, in the real estate listings that surface for these houses today, you encounter a phrase that appears so reliably it has almost become a genre of its own. Original details throughout: marble entrance hall, herringbone floors, carved mahogany paneling, coffered ceilings, multiple wood-burning fireplaces. And then, almost as an afterthought, Asking price, $65 million. The phrase original details is doing a great deal of work. It is simultaneously a description of the house and an argument about it. An argument that what was built here between 1895 and 1915 at staggering cost and with a level of craft that no longer exists at scale represents a quality of construction so far outside the reach of the present moment that its mere survival is a kind of miracle. Which is true, but the phrase also quietly sidesteps something, the question of what those details actually cost, who paid for them, and what the money was doing besides producing beautiful rooms. So let's follow the money. The limestone facade itself was, by definition, a declaration of surplus. 19th century builders used brownstone because it was cheaper. The choice of limestone was not a practical decision, it was an extravagant one. Acquiring that stone in quantity for a private residence, having it cut and shaped and carved by skilled craftsmen across the full street facade of a standard Manhattan lot, was a statement about the scale of one's resources before the house even had a front door. The numbers, where we have them, are instructive. A row of limestone townhouses built on Convent Avenue in Morningside Heights in 1899, speculative houses, not Fifth Avenue plutocrat commissions, carried projected construction costs of roughly $15,000 each. For prime Upper East Side mansions with steel beam framing, elevator shafts, marble entrance halls, mahogany-paneled libraries, and servants' infrastructure running from basement to roofline, the budgets were substantially higher, and 1014 Fifth Avenue was a speculative house. Not a bespoke commission, not the most expensive on the block. The panic of 1907 had rattled the market, and even the Hall brothers, experienced and well-capitalized, had to negotiate a discount. It reminds us that behind the limestone confidence sat real financial exposure. These were not risk-free investments. They were large bets on a neighborhood's continued ascent, and the bets occasionally required patience. Once purchased, the economics did not simplify. Running a limestone townhouse at the level its architecture implied was a continuous, expensive undertaking. A wealthy Gilded Age household typically employed around 20 servants, with wages ranging from $18 to $150 a month per person depending on role, plus food, uniforms, and the infrastructure to house them. That is a monthly payroll before any other household expense that ran well into the thousands of dollars, every month without interruption. The house did not run itself. It required a small organization. Beyond staffing, the building demanded constant attention. Coal deliveries, ash removal, chimney maintenance, marble floors, copper roofs, gas systems retrofitted for electricity, hydraulic elevators replaced with electric ones. Every decade brought a new round of expensive adaptation. The limestone facade was permanent. Everything behind it was in constant motion. This is why the financial history of these houses is not a straight line upward. Some owners held them for decades. Others found the maintenance burden unsustainable far sooner than expected. By the 1920s and 1930s, as property taxes rose and the available pool of domestic servants shrank, many limestone mansions began to change hands. Some were sold to developers who saw the land as more valuable than the house. Some were subdivided into apartments. Some were sold to cultural institutions willing to take on the maintenance costs in exchange for the address and the grandeur. The house at 15 East 63rd Street, 5 floors plus cellar, carved limestone facade, Beaux-Arts ornament by John H. Duncan, was split into multiple apartments in the mid-20th century and became known for a time as the House of Cassini, occupied by the fashion designer Oleg Cassini. The architectural shell that Elias Asiel had commissioned in 1901 as a single-family statement had within 50 years been carved into something rather different. The original details remained. The original intention did not. The limestone facade, in this reading, was not architecture, it was marketing. the physical form of a pitch, an argument that this particular block, this particular stone, this particular carved cornice above the second-floor windows was worth the price being asked. And for several decades, the market agreed. The irony is that the very qualities that made these houses so expensive to build are the same qualities that make them so valuable today. The craftsmanship that cannot be replicated, the materials that cost twice as much now in real terms as they did then. When a limestone townhouse sells today for $60 or $70 million, it is not selling as a home in any ordinary sense. It is selling as a proof of concept, proof that there was a moment in American history when private individuals could marshal the resources to build something of this permanence, and that the building has lasted long enough to carry that proof forward into the present. What it no longer carries is the weight of what happened on the other side of the wall. Somewhere in the middle of a limestone townhouse on East 79th Street, past the entrance hall with its marble floor, past the grand staircase, past the drawing room and the library and the formal dining room, there is a door that most visitors never noticed. Not because it was hidden exactly, because it was designed to be overlooked. Behind that door was a staircase, narrower than the main stair, steeper, plainly finished. It ran from the basement kitchen all the way to the top floor, passing through every level of the house without ever entering any of the rooms the family used. Food came up through it, laundry went down, servants moved through it at all hours of the day, beginning before the household had woken and continuing after it had gone to sleep. It was, functionally, the spine of the building, and it was invisible. That invisibility was not accidental. It was the point. To understand a limestone townhouse, you have to understand it as two buildings sharing one shell. The front building, carved facade, tall French windows, iron balconies looking out over the street, was designed to be seen. The back building, the service stair, the dumbwaiter shaft, the basement kitchen, the top-floor dormitories, was designed to function. And the entire architectural project of these houses was the management of the relationship between those two things, making the front visible, making the back disappear. The architects who designed these houses were not naive about this. They were extraordinarily deliberate about it. Start from the street. The approach to a limestone townhouse begins at the stoop, a short flight of limestone steps rising to a principal entrance framed by classical pilasters and a carved stone surround. The stoop is elevated above the sidewalk. Guests do not walk directly from the public world into the private one. They climb to reach the door. The elevation is partly practical. It places the principal floor above the noise and dirt of the street, and partly symbolic. At the base of that stoop, level with the sidewalk or just below it, is a second entrance, smaller, plainer. No carved surround, no ceremony. This is the service entrance opening directly into the basement level where the kitchen sits. Shahi, coal deliveries came through here. The laundress entered here before dawn. The butcher's boy and the iceman and everyone else whose presence served the house but did not ornament it, they used this door. The same limestone block contained two entirely separate modes of access, designed never to intersect except at the precise moments the household required. Inside, the vertical logic of the house reinforces this separation at every level. The basement held everything the house needed to run: kitchen, coal, boiler, laundry, everything that produced heat, noise, and smell. This is where the most physically demanding labor occurred: cooking over coal or gas ranges, boiling laundry in large copper tubs, hauling coal from the cellar to the boilers, and carrying the ash back out. Heavy, hot, constant work, entirely out of sight of every room the family occupied. From the basement kitchen, a dumbwaiter, a small mechanical lift running in its own shaft within the wall, carried food upward to the butler's pantry on the dining floor, where it was plated and transferred to the dining room with as little visible labor as possible. The dining room itself, with its coffered ceiling and mahogany paneling and long table set for a formal dinner, was designed to make food appear to arrive by something close to magic. The dumbwaiter was the mechanism behind the trick. Nobody at the table was meant to think about the kitchen 2 floors below or the hands that had cooked in it since early morning. The main stair, by contrast, was a performance in itself. In houses like 4 East 79th Street or 15 East 63rd Street, the principal staircase was one of the architectural focal points of the interior, wide, curved, or straight run, with a carved balustrade and decorative ironwork rising through the center of the house toward a skylight above. Guests ascending this stair were meant to feel the house gathering around them, communicating through every material detail: the marble, the mahogany, the plaster ornament, the seriousness of the family's investment in beauty. The stair was a message. The service stair behind the wall was a mechanism. At 1014 Fifth Avenue, the fireproof service stair runs from the basement to the 4th floor, adjoining the butler's pantry, then continues upward through a passage that allows staff to reach every level without entering the family's domain. This is precise architectural planning, a circulation diagram in which 2 populations move through the same building on routes designed to keep them almost entirely separate, intersecting only at the moments the household script required. A door opened, a dish delivered, a room prepared before the family arrived in it. The top floor completes the picture. At 1014 Fifth Avenue, the uppermost level contained 7 single rooms and 2 double rooms with shared baths, the servants' dormitories. Small rooms, plainly, finished, under a mansard roof that on the outside read as an elegant copper-clad crown to the building's facade. On the inside, that roof meant heat in summer trapped directly above the sleeping rooms, cold in winter with the wind finding every gap, and soot from the chimneys below settling on everything. The servants who slept here began their days before 6 in the morning and ended them after 10 at night, and the rooms they returned to bore no resemblance to the rooms they had spent the day maintaining. 7 stories of building. The bottom and the top belonged to the people who made it run. The middle floors belonged to the family it was built to serve. Before the family was awake, the house was already working. Somewhere around 6 in the morning, sometimes earlier, the cook descended to the basement kitchen and began the coal range. The kitchen maid followed, then the scullery maid. A footman moved quietly through the upper floors, relighting fires that had burned low overnight, carrying coal scuttles up the back stair 2 at a time. The laundress, if it was her day, had already started the copper boiler in the basement laundry, where the water needed time to heat before the sheets could go in. The butler had risen earlier still, checking the silver, reviewing the day's schedule, confirming that the dining room was laid correctly for whatever the afternoon required. By the time the family appeared at the breakfast table, the house had already been running for 2 or 3 hours, every fire lit, every surface cleared, every room put in order. The arrival of the family into their own house was, in a practical sense, the second act of a performance whose first act they had never witnessed. That staff, all 20 of them, never left the building when the day ended. The arithmetic is worth sitting with for a moment. 4 people living in a house, a staff of equal size making it possible for them to live there in the way they expected to live. The household ran as a structured organization, butler at the top, responsible for the dining room, the silver, the wine cellar, housekeeper governing the female staff below her, a full roster of women whose titles told you exactly where you stood. Every one of these people lived in the building they worked in. The butler had a room near the pantry. The housekeeper had a room near the linen closet. The other staff slept on the top floor, in the rooms tucked under the mansard roof, rooms they had no hand in designing and no power to change. Their meals were eaten in the servants' hall in the basement after the family's meals had been prepared and served. They were not free to receive visitors in their rooms or to leave the house without permission or to use the main staircase or the family elevator. Their presence in the main rooms of the house was required to be minimal, efficient, and silent, appearing at the right moment, disappearing afterward, leaving no trace of themselves in the rooms they had just cleaned and prepared. The house had been designed at the level of floor plans and stair placement and dumbwaiter shafts to make this possible, to allow 20 people to live and work in a building in near total invisibility to the 5 people the building was nominally for. The servants themselves were, in the main, immigrants, Irish, German, and Scandinavian workers, along with smaller numbers from other European countries. Domestic service offered relatively stable wages, provided housing, and carried a respectability that factory work did not. But it was confining in ways that other employment was not. The servant's body was on call. The servant's time was not her own. Her references, those written endorsements from previous employers that determined her ability to find the next position, were held by the people she worked for, creating a dependency that constrained her. Options well beyond the formal terms of employment. What is striking, given all of this, is how quickly they left. Unlike Britain, where domestic service could be a lifelong career, American servants moved on. Most stayed for a year or two, then left, to better-paying positions, to marriage, to other kinds of work as the industrial economy expanded. In the household management manuals and society columns of the period, this departure was discussed with remarkable consistency and remarkable self-revelation. One household guide from 1904 put it plainly: a good servant was becoming as difficult to keep as to find. The framing is instructive. A servant seeking better conditions was not understood as a reasonable exercise of individual choice. It was framed as a disruption, an inconvenience imposed on the household by someone who owed it, if not loyalty exactly, then at least stability. The limestone facade projected permanence. The workforce behind it was anything but, and the owners, absorbed in the management of that paradox, seem rarely to have asked themselves why the people they depended on were in such a hurry to leave, because the limestone townhouse, for all its architectural argument about civilization and culture and the proper arrangement of a refined life, was built on a straightforward transaction. 20 people's labor exchanged for wages that ranged from $18 to $150 a month, with housing and meals provided but autonomy withheld. The house could not have functioned without that transaction. The carved garlands on the facade, the coffered ceilings in the dining room, none of it existed without the cook at the range at 6 a.m. and the footman on the back stair with the coal scuttle and the laundress in the basement boiling sheets in water that had taken an hour to heat. The original detail that every listing forgets to mention: the house ran on. People. And the people were never part of the tour. By around 1910, something had shifted on Fifth Avenue. Not the stone. That was still pale and precise and confident as ever, the carved garlands still catching the morning light above each entrance. But the conversation around it had changed. The question was no longer whether a limestone townhouse was the right way to live. The question, increasingly quietly and then less quietly, was whether anyone still wanted to live that way at all. The limestone townhouse had been built on a specific set of assumptions: that a wealthy family would want a single building to themselves, spread vertically across 5 or 6 or 7 floors, that they would want and be able to maintain the full domestic organization that running it required, that the social performance of receiving guests in a double-height drawing room, of setting a long table in a paneled dining room, of moving through the formal sequences of Gilded Age, entertaining, was worth the cost and the complexity that made it possible. Those assumptions had not been wrong. For a generation they had been the organizing logic of elite New York life. But the generation that had built these houses was aging, and the one coming behind it had grown up in a city that was changing faster than the mansions had been designed to accommodate. The apartment building was coming, and it would change everything. The first luxury apartment buildings on the Upper East Side had appeared even while the limestone mansions were still being commissioned. By 1910, architects like J.E.R. Carpenter and, slightly later, Rosario Candela were designing residential buildings on Park and Fifth Avenues that offered something the townhouse could not: the scale and finish of a mansion floor without the obligation of managing the floors above and below it. A wealthy family could have their marble entrance hall, their paneled library, their formal dining room, their servants, and then close their front door on all of it and let the building handle the rest. No boiler to oversee, no roof to maintain, no coal cellar to manage, no responsibility for the 7 rooms under the mansard where the housemaids slept. It turned out that what the very rich wanted was not the building. It was what the building contained, and the apartment house offered to separate those things. The shift was not instantaneous, and it was not without resistance. For many of the families who had built or bought limestone townhouses, the house was not simply a residence but a statement, a public position on Fifth Avenue that an apartment, however grand, could not quite replicate. The address mattered. The individual facade mattered. The fact that the building was yours, entirely yours, from basement kitchen to roofline, carried a meaning that a floor in a cooperative building did not. But as maintenance costs rose through the 1910s and 1920s, as domestic servants became harder to find and more expensive to retain, and as the social rituals that had justified a 7-story household began to feel anachronistic, the calculation shifted, family by family. Then came the demolitions, and the calculation became stark. In the 1920s, several of the great Vanderbilt mansions, houses that had been built to outlast everyone who knew them, were sold to developers and came down. Within months, some of the grandest private residences ever built in America were rubble, replaced by apartment towers, by office blocks, by the argument that the land was worth more empty than occupied. The limestone facades that had been built to last forever lasted, in some cases, barely 25 years before the economics made them expendable. The survivors tended to survive for specific reasons. Some were on blocks that resisted apartment development, the Cook Block being the clearest example. Some were converted rather than demolished. The Warburg Mansion on Fifth Avenue became the Jewish Museum. Houses on East 63rd and 79th Streets were carved into apartments for decades before eventually being restored. Survival required reinvention. The ones that refused to reinvent tended not to survive. The 1916 zoning resolution had tried to stabilize the avenue's character through law, imposing setbacks and use restrictions that shaped what could be built and where. But it could not stop the underlying economic logic. When a single-family townhouse on a prime block represented millions of dollars in land value sitting beneath a structure that cost tens of thousands of dollars a year to run, the argument for preservation was always fighting uphill against the argument for return on investment. The Gilded Age had built in limestone because it wanted permanence. What it got instead was a very expensive argument about how long permanence could afford to last. A small number of families still live that way today. Not many. The number of households occupying a full limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side as a single-family residence, 7 floors, coffered dining room, servant stair behind the wall, is small enough that each house is by now something close to a category of its own. They are known by their addresses the way certain paintings are known by the museums that hold them. 15 East 63rd Street, 4 East 79th Street, $65 million, $68 million, numbers that are not really prices so much as they are verdicts, a market's assessment of what it costs to own the last intact examples of something that for 25 years at the turn of the last century had seemed like it would define Fifth Avenue forever. In 1965, New York City established the Landmarks Preservation Commission. In 1981, the Upper East Side Historic District was designated. The irony is not lost in the documents. The same families who had built these houses to project dynastic permanence ultimately needed the government to enforce that permanence on their behalf. Private wealth had built the argument. The state was now in the business of maintaining it. The designation restricts what can be altered on protected facades, which means that the carved garlands above the windows and the copper mansard roof lines and the limestone stoops are, to a meaningful degree, permanent now, in a way they were not for most of the 20th century. The facades will remain. The interiors are another matter. Behind protected street walls, the rooms have been remade repeatedly, gutted and rebuilt for modern systems, for art collections requiring humidity control, for the tastes and requirements of buyers who have no particular connection to the families that first commissioned them. The original details that survive are the ones that were too beautiful or too structurally embedded to remove. Everything else has been updated, modernized, replaced. The house presents its limestone face to the street unchanged. What it contains is rarely the same twice. Contemporary architects report renewed interest in limestone for new luxury projects in the city, chosen precisely because of the associations the stone carries. New money again, reaching for the visual grammar of old money. Elias Asil made this move in 1901. The Hall brothers made it when they built to face the Metropolitan Museum and borrow its authority. This is, in its way, the final chapter of what the limestone facade was always doing. It was always a performance. It was always the public argument that the private reality was supposed to support. And the modern limestone townhouse, landmarked, restored, sold for tens of millions to buyers whose wealth comes from hedge funds and private equity rather than railroads and wholesale groceries, continues to make exactly the same argument it made in 1907, that this stone is permanent, that the family behind it belongs here, that money of this kind has weight and duration and the right to take up this much space on this particular street. The argument has not changed. Only the people making it have. The limestone townhouse was never really about limestone. It was about what limestone meant: permanence, legitimacy, the right kind of history attached to a very new kind of fortune. That meaning has survived every economic cycle, every wave of demolition, every conversion and subdivision and restoration. It has outlasted the families who first commissioned it, the servants who ran it, the social rituals it was built to contain. The stone remains, pale and carved and confident, facing the street the way it has always faced the street, still making its argument, still asking to be believed. And on Fifth Avenue, at least, it still works.